Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the 6th Annual Racism Lab Symposium on the Study of Race and Racism. My name is Maggie Hicken, and I'm on faculty here at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan and the co-founder and faculty director for Racism Lab. We're an interdisciplinary research collective focused on research and career development of scholars who study racism through a critical lens. I am so excited that for this year's symposium, Racism Lab is partnering with the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Health Science, IAPHS, to make our meeting a national forum. So while this symposium is being viewed in the US and some of Canada, Racism Lab members, we do our work here at the University of Michigan. And therefore, I would like to acknowledge our university's origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabe and Wyandot nations. And I draw the words from this acknowledgement from our Department of Ecology here. Our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands generally in unconscionable ways from Indigenous peoples. Knowing where we live and work does not change the past, but a thorough understanding of the ongoing consequences of the past can empower us in our research, teaching, and outreach to create a future that supports human flourishing and justice for all individuals. Today's theme is toxic equilibrium, structural racism, and population health inequities. We define racism in a very interdisciplinary way, drawing first from Charles Mills, a philosopher. He says that racism is, quote, a political system, a particular power structure of formal and informal rule, societal privilege, and the norms for the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties, end quote. We draw further from psychologist Shelley Harrell, who says, quote, where members of the dominant group create or accept their societal privilege by maintaining structures, ideologies, values, and behavioral norms that have the intent or effect of leaving non-dominant group members relatively excluded from power, esteem, status, and or equal access to societal resources, end quote. In short, philosopher Achille Mbembe says, quote, racism is above all a technology aimed at the use of biopower, end quote. And this is the tool that allows us as a society to ultimately regulate the distribution of death. So first, cultural racism has many different definitions, but we define it as a society's culture that racializes different social groups and then puts them into a hierarchy. Cultural racism encompasses the socially accepted ideologies, values, and behavioral norms ultimately set by the dominant power group. Cultural racism is a particularly insidious form of racism as it operates on the level of our shared social subconscious. The processes that comprise cultural racism are invisible because many are givens and our assumptions and our defaults. But the result then is this reified set of ideologies, values, and behavioral norms. So cultural racism then ultimately shapes the answers to the question, whose life counts, who is disposable, and who is truly American. Structural racism then can be considered the actualization or the application of cultural racism. Our social structure is composed of the formal and informal institutions in our society. These institutions are interrelated and symbiotic in nature. Changes in one institution can be felt in other institutions, and importantly, we attempt to intervene toward equity in one institution, other institutions will move in to restore the equilibrium set up by cultural racism, ultimately toward white privilege. We selected the phrase toxic equilibrium because we wanted to bring in the term toxic in reference to the health impact of structural racism. This term is really used in the environmental literature. However, in reality, the socio-political environment is just as toxic, resulting in health inequities. So today we have a full day of activities, and you will be allowed to move in and out with using your Zoom. So we're starting off with the keynote address, and then at noon, 1:45 and 3:30 Eastern time, we have 3 amazing panels, all approaching the study of structural racism in very different ways. And then finally at 5 o'clock, we have an interactive poster session where all of the posters presenters will be discussing their posters together, and we are going to, we have a moderated question and answer where everybody can ask questions, and we kind of integrate these posters into a single discussion. So some tips for today: your personal Zoom link that you received either last week or this week will work all day, so you can come out through the webinar throughout the day. And questions will be taken through Zoom's Q&A feature, and the chat feature will be disabled. And you can, a detailed program with all of the bios and everything, pictures of all of the people participating and who work behind the scenes, was mailed to you from IAPHS yesterday, so check your email. And a recording of this entire program will be deposited into the IAPHS electronic library and available for the members. Membership fees are very reasonable and relatively low for students and junior scholars. And I highly recommend that if you approach health or structural racism from an interdisciplinary lens, bringing in other disciplines, other fields of study into your work, I highly recommend this organization. And then also you can join the conversation. We'll be live tweeting, RacismLab and IEPHS will be live tweeting today. And you can also use the hashtag toxic equilibrium, structural racism, and population health. So all scholarship is subjective. When we marginalize the brilliant voices who bring their own subjectivity, science suffers because we omit large pieces of information on the ways in which our society operates. Charles Mills, noted philosopher, has spoken of the lack of Black and Latinx men and women in philosophy. The problem, he said, is that demographic whiteness sustains conceptual whiteness. I think that we can say this is true for all of our academic disciplines, and then also true in the field too. Our science suffers when we only see the world through a white lens. Racism Lab was formed in 2015 to ensure that scholars, an environment that combines collaborative and critical feedback that builds their own ideas into full research ideas without the barriers that academic dogma with its white academic lens, with its white lens presents. Our activities include this annual symposium on the study of race and racism. This event would not have been possible without many hours of labor of our graduate student coordinators, Gabby Peterson and Ramona Perry. In addition to their dissertation work, the isolated nature of doctoral life, particularly at a predominantly white institution, and the many personal and academic challenges presented by the pandemic, Gabby and Ramona have led the production of an incredibly intellectually stimulating symposium this year, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work with them over this past year. Many members of Racism Lab also volunteered their time in support of this symposium, including Kayla Fike, Kiana Bess, Louis Miles, Kathleen Soul, Mike Esposito, and Miles Durkee. You will see also later today that the Wayne State members of Racism Lab convened one of our panel presentations. So this day also would not have been possible without a lot of effort and resources from many people, including people from IAPHS and the Institute for Social Research. And I am particularly grateful to the Survey Research Center for continuing to generously sponsor this symposium every year. So follow along, and I'm going to now pass over the virtual podium to Gabby Peterson, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gabrielle Peterson, and I'm a graduate co-coordinator of Racism Lab, as well as a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology here at University of Michigan. I remember some of my earlier experiences reading Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva's work at my historically white college in undergrad, and I am so happy to be in the space of interdisciplinary scholars who are interested in research that applies critical theoretical frameworks like structural racism to their research on inequalities in health, environment, education, and more. Furthermore, I'm honored to have the opportunity to share some remarks that may offer a little insight into the local and broader impacts of Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva's work. Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva's writing and mentoring is foundational to our community here at Racism Lab and has helped us to serve scholars at various points in their journeys through the academic pipeline. While unfortunately he was not still faculty on campus when this group started in 2015, the impact of his work is evidenced through the formation of our group and our activities. His American Sociological Review article and later publication of Racism Without Racist were essential readings that influenced the way we defined and measured race in our respective research projects. Shifting from ideological definitions of race or solely overt examples, our core group research projects emphasize the persistence of white supremacy through work on lynchings, neighborhood level violence, code switching, and many other projects listed on our website, as well as collaborative work like the Racial Landscapes Project led by Dr. Maggie or Margaret Hicken. While the American Sociological Review article is noted for contributing a definition of racism, it was also a foundation for future texts that guided sociologists, especially race sociologists, on the way we were, the way we are, and the way we should be. Following that, he has contributed to our understanding of manifestations of new racism through various publications, including but not limited to White Supremacy in the Post-Civil Rights Era, Racism Without Racist, in its 5 editions, along with co-authored books like White Logic, White Methods, and dozens of other peer-reviewed articles. Further work on the Latino Americanization of the United States was significant in asserting the connectivity between mechanisms that maintain white supremacy here with similar explanations for other racial orders in other international contexts. These theories are significant not only for their affronts to anti-Blackness in these contexts, but because they are reminiscent of his University of Wisconsin-Madison dissertation study on the political economy of squatters in Puerto Rico from 1990 to 1992. Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva's expertise spans racial theory, but also includes class analysis, political sociology, and the sociology of development. His work has not been restricted to universities, but has also contributed to the broader discipline of sociology. His writing has been recognized by disciplinary awards, including the ASA section on racial and ethnic minorities, Oliver C. Cox Book Award, the Louis A. Kozer Award for Theoretical Agenda Setting, and the Cox Johnson Fraser Award in 2011. In 2018, he served as the ASA president. In his address, he surprised traditional structuralists with his interest in focusing on racialized emotions. He said, "Eradicating racism will require a radical process to uproot its visible, objective components, as well as demolish its emotional skeleton." I'm one of many who can describe the contributions of his work and broader implications, but there's a smaller, very fortunate sample of students who can attest to his mentoring. In addition to being a foundational critical scholar, one of his students, David G. Embrick, says that Dr. Bonilla-Silva was the reason that we went to graduate school, the reason we wanted to study racism, the reason we stayed the course in graduate school through thick and thin. And speaking on behalf of his colleagues, David said they will also state that he is one of the toughest mentors around, challenging his students constantly to think beyond existing sociological canons. I, among others on campus and beyond, have so many great things to share about Dr. Bonilla-Silva, but we are here to hear from him and others who are inspired by his work later on in the evening. Thank you so much to the generous support from Racism Lab, IAPHS, and the SRC. It is my pleasure to introduce the James B. Duke Professor of Sociology, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, to share what makes systemic racism systemic. Please join me in welcoming him to our virtual stage.
The title of my talk today is What Makes Systemic Racism Systemic? And let me begin by acknowledging the obvious, which is that I know some people in the audience, perhaps most, feel a bit anxious and apprehensive because talking about racism is dangerous, yeah? But I want you to relax because one of my big points today will be that we're all mostly unwilling, habituated participants of systemic racism. However, do not relax too much. So my agenda today is the following. First, I will explain what I mean by systemic racism, or what it means. Second, I will address the character of systemic racism in contemporary America, what I call in my work the new racism. Third, I will briefly address the ideology that supports and works with systemic racism in contemporary America that I call colorblind racism. Then I will briefly address how systemic racism gets embedded in organizations like historically white colleges and universities like Michigan or Duke or Wisconsin or what have you. And I will briefly also address how it's embedded in the medical system at large. And then end up talking about how do we all participate and what needs to be done. So please fasten your intellectual seatbelts, because I will go like in the movie, fast and furious. So first, what is systemic racism? In the past, we used to believe that it was the bad apples, the Klan, or the neo-Klan. So it's sort of the bad apples theory of racism. But I'm going to argue that the trick to understand adequately what systemic racism is all about is understanding its systemic, comprehensive character, and how we all participate in the system, whether we like it or not. And my first publication that I drafted while I was a professor at Michigan, I addressed that in 1997, I think. So accordingly, systemic racism is or refers to societies where social, political, economic, cultural, and even psychological rewards are partially allocated by race. And I say partially for the obvious reasons that in modern societies, race, as central as it is not the only factor of social stratification. So we have to appreciate the significance of class, gender, sexual orientation, and other social positions. So that means also that systemic racism has a history. We can date it. It's not a system that has been with us since antiquity. It actually emerged in the modern era, in the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. And it has gone through periods. So in the US, we can think about slavery as a period, genocide slavery. We can also think about Jim Crow. And today, in the so-called post-civil rights era, we can talk about the new racism as the character, organizing, and structuring practices in the nation. Secondly, structural. So I've been arguing that for 30 years, which is, although we have individual people who are more active in the racial beliefs and actions, we're all racialized actors. Therefore, the important thing is not the random acts of certain actors, but the collective practices that produce and reproduce positions. And lastly, a more harder to accept is that systemic racism has a material foundation. The system is maintained because some people benefit by the way that things are. Therefore, they defend the racial order of things in various ways. Some do it in an aggressive way, overtly, but as Martin Luther King reminded us, the fundamental problem of systemic racism in America is not about the Ku Klux Klan, but about the white moderates who are more devoted to order than to justice. In the US, this is a brief recap of 300 years of history. So we had slavery, and we had genocide, and we had land theft, not just of indigenous peoples, but also of Mexico. Mexico lost in the 19th century half of its territory to the US, and a third of what we call today the US used to be Mexico. We also had imperialism from the get-go, except that our imperialism, unlike the European variety, has been sort of a hidden imperial project because we did it within a contiguous territory. However, we did have and still have classical colonialism, and the primary example is the case of Puerto Rico. Think about Trump during Hurricane Maria, thinking about, even though all Puerto Ricans are citizens, he was contemplating and pondering whether or not he could divest from this asset and trade it or sell it. We also have the ongoing racialization of all people of color, and obviously exploitation of workers of color. But I want to suggest that racialization is not just of people of color, because obviously systemic racism is relationally, so you cannot think about the problems of people of color without understanding if someone has problems, someone is causing them, yeah? So whites have also experienced racialization, and here you have the case, recent case, of Venezuelans in southern Florida who are in the process of becoming white. Nothing new under the sun, because all the people who belong now to the white team went through a process of racialization, not entering the country as white, but struggling to become white. And now we have books left and right explaining how the Irish became white, how Jews became white, how Italians became white. So everybody seems to be talking about systemic racism these days. And in truth, let's be honest, this started, as we all know, after the George Floyd lynching. Then we started using this term systemic racism. But I want to suggest that most of us don't know what we're talking about and the implications of taking the stand that racism is systemic. And I'm going to give you a liminal examples. So Joe Biden and many liberals, moderates, refer and address and mention that police departments suffer from systemic racism, but immediately claim that most police officers are not racist, therefore reverting to the notion of racism as a matter of bad apples. And I want to suggest that the police suffer from systemic racism because of the way that police officers are selected, how they are trained, the culture they develop, the militarization of the police apparatus since the 1960s, etc. And because of all these things together, these things guarantee that even quote unquote good police officers will carry out race-based policing. And I want to give you a liminal example to test my argument. So this is a young African-American college student in Atlanta, Georgia, who was brutalized by police officers, I think in June. And here are the police officers who brutalized him. And some of you in the audience may be thinking, but most of them are Black and Black people cannot, which is not true, because data shows that Black police officers and Latino police officers are as likely as use lethal force against folks of color. And that is because from the get-go, from slavery onwards, from the genocide period, some people of color, a small segment, but an important segment nonetheless, participated in defense of systemic racism. The painting you have there, the picture is of the Metoyer patriarch of a family in Louisiana. And this family, the Metoyer family, owned over 200 Africans. So therefore, they were slaveholders, which explains why people like the Metoyer family and other Creoles wanted to fight during the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. And of course, we still have people of color, Black, Latinos, Asian Americans, etc., who participate on the side of systemic racism. Now, in general, the defense of the racial order is by not only police officers, but I'm going to argue today strongly by RWF, regular white folks. And now we have case after case of Barbecue Becky, Permit Becky. Some of you know about Cornerstone Caroline. This is a woman in Brooklyn who accused a 9-year-old Black boy of grabbing her behind. The tape showed that it's a bodega, small place, and the kid was with his backpack. So accidentally, the backpack just touched her behind, and she immediately claimed that she had been sexually assaulted. Thankfully, there are also divisions on the white side of the equation. So we have witnessed how many whites have participated in the Black Lives Matter mobilization. Of course, I am agnostic about whether or not they will continue that participation, because I suspect that most ultimately will return to whiteness as usual, much like they did in the 1960s to the civil rights movement. But keep hope alive, as some leaders, Jesse Jackson, used to say in the past. And I want to give you examples about how these predictions about behavior are also problematic. Here you have the leader of the Proud Boys, who happens to be a Black Cuban, Enrique Tarrio. So race obviously has these individual elements, and you can make large predictions, but on the case by case, you may miss here and there. And as you probably heard, last week we learned that Enrique Tarrio apparently was a police informant 10, 15 years ago. So who knows what's going on with Mr. Tarrio. So systemic racism has economic foundation, and I notice that I put economic in quotation marks because I want to suggest that the economic foundation is more just than financial matters. That said, we know that whites as a group have made 35–40% more in terms of income than Blacks and Latinos in the last 120, 150 years. But as important as the income differences are, the most important financial component is the wealth gap. And at Duke, we have one of the experts, my friend and colleague, Sandy Darity, has been documenting this for 40 years. And as you can see in this chart, that ratio has been average about 9%, meaning Black and Latinos have about 9% of their net worth as whites during the last 40 years. And as I suggested, economic interests are important, but they don't explain all because humans do not live on bread alone. America's racial order provides them advantages in terms of neighborhoods, colleges, and parks, better social estimation, given that the entire culture heralds whiteness. If you are white, the police is on your side. And I want to show you a picture, and I alert you, the picture is hard to watch, but we have seen it many, many, many times. So on the left, you have Dylan Roof, who had just murdered 9 people in a church in South Carolina. And in his case, he was arrested with no incident. I remind you, he had a weapon, so more reason for the police to be extremely cautious, but no incident. On the way to the police station, he complained he was hungry, so the police officer stopped at a Burger King and bought him a hamburger. On the right, you have George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So all these things, the financial as well as non-financial benefits that accrue to whiteness, are what constitute the material foundation of systemic racism. So whites then have developed an interest in not rocking the racial vote because the vote is good for them. Similarly, those who are not white develop an interest in altering the path of this vote to improve our lot in this country or in any racialized society. So let me now move and talk briefly about the nature of the contemporary systemic racism. And it's important for you to understand that although some people claim, oh, we have racism today because we had slavery, that is not the right answer. The answer is after slavery, we had a new formation that we call Jim Crow or apartheid. And after Jim Crow ended for the most part in the late 1960s, a new system emerged that I have called in my work the new racism, to refer to the suave but quite effective character of most practices that reproduce white privilege. So for example, discrimination has changed for the most part. So now if you go to a store, back in the day in the store, I would be excluded because you're Black or Latino, and Black Latino the worst, so we don't want you in the store. Today, they still don't like me, so I'm patrolled, or I am assassinated with politeness. May I help you? Just looking. May I help you? Still looking. May I help you? Yes, you can help me. I'm trying to steal this fancy coat. And I was wondering if you could give me. No, I didn't mean it like that. I said, yes, you did. So anyway, there is a new character of systemic discrimination. People in the audience curious about this, we now have systematic data through the audit strategy that we use for housing, we use for everything, yeah, where you basically match testers, white, non-white, send them to buy a car, send them to a store, send them to a restaurant, send them to a bank, send them to do anything in America, and compare notes and find whether or not they experience differential treatment. And the findings in restaurant, the finding in banking, etc., shows that we experience, differential treatment, inferior treatment. Avoidance of racist terminology, and I'm not saying that people don't use the language of the past, but people are more strategic. And then a racial agenda that avoids, again, directness. So you may be talking about inner city problems. Everybody knows what they mean, but we don't say Black people's problems, yeah? Or we talk about welfare reform, even though the assumption is that that reform will have a inordinate effect on Black people. Lastly, many of the mechanisms are sort of invisible to the polity at large, to people at large, but I want to suggest that they're invisible to white folks, yeah? Like police brutality was not invisible to us, people of color. We knew that we were surveilled and monitored and experienced discrimination because of residential segregation, most whites were not aware of this until the advent of the cell phone technology. So now we have video after video after video showing police brutality. Here you have the picture of Eric Garner, who made infamous the phrase, I can't breathe, which George Floyd used again 10, 15 years later. And unfortunately, a cell phone is important and has allowed us to sort of validate the reality of police brutality, but it has not prevented the continuation of the practice. This is in December, Maurice Hills, visiting friends, I think, maybe even family members, and he came out of the garage with his arms up and a cell phone. And you know that in the white imagination, a cell phone or anything turns into a revolver, into a gun. So he was shot and was not provided assistance by the police officer. And again, some of the practices of the past have been re-articulated, so we still have that old practice that emerged in the 1930s or so by the government of housing segregation maintained through redlining. And the redlining strategy, as you all know, implied that if you came from a poor minority neighborhood, you were going to get an inferior loan independent of your financial situation. And that practice continues today. If you want more on these practices, there is a book. I apologize, but I'm Black and Puerto Rican, so I got to make my money. So that book has all the material on the new racism. So to be clear, I'm not a fool, so I'm saying that new racism is dominant or hegemonic, but obviously we still have the Klan, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, all kinds of boys. So the past has been retooled and rearticulated in the present and may even continue in the future. Now quickly, let me talk about the ideology that glues this new racial order. And in my work, I have called it colorblind racism. Because we're in colleges, the stuff I'm going to address now is stuff that is quite familiar to us. So by colorblind racism, I mean the new dominant racial ideology anchored on the abstract and decontextualized extension of the principles of liberalism to explain all kinds of racial matters. And in the book, I deconstruct the ideology. I explain that it has frames. Those of you familiar with my work know that I talk about abstract liberalism, and I'll give you one example shortly, naturalization, etc. I also talk about the style of the ideology, which allows users to articulate their viewpoints in a somewhat safe way. So I talk about, for example, semantic moves such as, I'm not a racist, but, or some of my best friends are Black. I don't know their names, but I know they are some of my best friends. And lastly, I talk about the racial stories that accompany this ideology. And we all know and heard and are acquainted with these stories, yeah? I did not own any slaves, so the past is the past. So let me give you one example. And the example is an invented example because I wanted to make it pertinent to Michigan. And it's Dr. Albie White III. I'm not a racist, but affirmative action is discrimination in reverse. And in the medical field, it's letting unqualified people get in. I mean, we all like Dr. Malcolm, and he's one of my best friends. But well, you know, being nice is not sufficient in this job. My son did not get into UM med school because they admitted a bunch of African Americans. What Black and Hispanic people need to do is work hard complain less, learn to speak proper English, and stop using racism as an excuse. After all, things are not as bad today, and people like me and my son, we did not own any slaves, and I want all of you to know that I'm a very good person. So what is the problem with Dr. White's stance? First, this is classic abstract liberalism, as he does not see the significance of race in society. And as we know, society is not race neutral. Race affects the life chances of Black folks and brown folks. To get a fair chance in jobs, we experience labor market discrimination anywhere between 30 to 50% of the time. We experience discrimination in housing, driving, walking, in med schools, when we are doctors, medical doctors or doctor of sociology. If you are Black or Latino in America, all of us who are not white experience differential treatment in all sorts of situations. And the blind spot for many whites or the progressive liberal side is that they assume that the issue is Black and Latino folks have problems. Native peoples have problems. Asian American people have problems. But you also have to connect, if someone has problems, it's because someone is getting advantages, yeah? And in the statement, you heard the rhetorical incoherence, something that I analyze in the book, the I mean, the semantic moves like I'm not a racist, but, and the racial stories, yeah? Oh, let me drink some water. How do you like my subliminal message? I told you, I'm Black and Puerto Rican. I don't have time to be subliminal. Anyway, 6th edition of my book is coming this year, so check it out. And now let me move quickly and address the organizational expression of systemic racism. That is, how systemic racism gets embedded in organizations. And I'm going to talk briefly about an organization that we all know, historically white colleges and universities. So we talk about HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, and we assume that those institutions are primarily oriented towards Blackness or Latino concerns. However, we universalize the rest of the colleges and universities, and we don't call them what they are, which is HWCUs. And these HWCUs have a history, a demography, a curriculum, a climate, and a set of symbols and traditions that embody, signify, and reproduce whiteness. And it is that organizational and cultural whiteness that produces the isolated incidents that keep happening semester after semester, year after year, across all these HWCUs. So at Duke, where I labor these days, we have had in the last, since I arrived, all kinds of incidents, including someone hanging a noose by the student center, an Asian theme party. Some of my students were in my class when that happened, so they showed me the poster, extremely racist poster. We had the N-word every 2-3 years. Someone decides to scroll it somewhere. You know, in this case, in the Black Culture Center at the Duke, we have faculty saying some ridiculous things. And of course, this is not just Duke. Michigan has had and will continue having, so long as you are an HWCU, racial issues left and right. But as important as the isolated incidents are, I want to suggest that it's of most significance how the entire organizational apparatus and culture reproduce whiteness. So I want to downplay, as important as the incidents are, the normative everyday way in which race and whiteness organizes our organization called HWCUs. So first, you have a curriculum that is mostly white-centered, and I have written a book about that. I think this is my last commercial, so relax. We have in the entire life in the university is mostly white-centered. So in my case, if I have another chicken wrap sandwich, I will die. So every event I go, hey, you want a chicken wrap sandwich? No, I want a roast con habichuelas y mofongo. I want some variety. Diversity is good. And you have white symbols, traditions, and culture that reproduce whiteness. So, for example, at UNC, the picture on the left is of Silent Sam. And even though students have been objecting to this statue forever, it wasn't until a year or 2 years ago that finally the statue came down. The students brought it down. In the middle, you have a statue of Venus as a symbol of beauty. And some of you may be thinking, what is problematic with that? Well, if the only symbol of beauty that you have in your campus is of Venus, what does that say about those of us who are not white? You see my point? So then whiteness becomes normative. Beauty is whiteness. And of course, we Black people, we indigenous peoples, we Asian Americans, we Latinos, and we, particularly we Puerto Ricans, we are the bomb. We look good. And of course, we have building after building named after white people, which makes us feel like Ralph Edison, the invisible people in these places. Here I have another example that is problematic and most people don't even get it. I have lectured again and again and again, thankfully. I'm invited to give talks across the nation, and often they put me in the president's room. This is the president's room at Princeton. The problem is that the president's room keeps having only the portraits and pictures of all the presidents. So because all the presidents have been white, then it looks like the Klan room. Everything is white. So in this, the part of the struggle is, I'm not saying to eliminate the portraits. I'm saying rethink the message and begin then changing the history, meaning begin thinking about presidents and provosts as potentially being Black, Asian American, Native Americans, and of course, Latinos. And particularly if you have a Black Puerto Rican candidate, that would be phenomenal. Michigan obviously also have had issues with the things I'm talking about. So recently you guys were changing the names of some buildings because their buildings were honoring races. So what is the impact of whiteness on people of color? So because we're seen as not belonging, when we walk on campus, we look or are viewed or regarded as suspicious by the campus police and by regular white folks who act as deputized agents of racial control. So I've labored so far in 3 different places. Michigan was my first one, then Texas A&M, and now at Duke. So at Michigan, just to give you one example, it's my 2nd year. I'm coming back to my office around 7:30, LS&A building. I had gotten some books from the library, actually quite a lot of them. So I had 2 bags of books, and I'm trying to go to my office in the 3rd floor, I think. And while I'm about to enter the elevator, a white, I think, graduate student look at me and tell me, "May I help you?" Sort of suggesting I was out of place. And I told him, "Yeah, you can help me. I'm going to my office. Do you mind carrying my books?" So he got a little bit like, and as soon as he could, he got off the elevator. Things happen at A&M, and now at Duke, I do what some white people call self-segregation. I stop coming to my office at night, even though theoretically, as a member of the community, I should be able to go to the office at night. But I don't want to die. And if in an encounter with the campus police or a regular white person, I might experience discrimination and react as I could, yeah, defending my rights. But in that process, we know what usually happens. We lose. So a question for white folks in the audience. How many times have the campus police or a regular white person has asked you, "Hey, are you lost? What are you doing here?" Etc. And if the answer is, as I suspect, no, here you have the differential impact of the campus culture and structure on your life chances. So what about the medical system? Does the medical system also have something like a history, demography, climate, and culture that reproduce whiteness? And my answer is absolutely yes. Not only the demography is mostly white, so as you can see, about 11% of doctors are Black or Latino, even though Blacks and Latinos are about 32% of the population. And the impact of that is that although the colorblind person says it doesn't matter if you're Black or white, if you're a doctor, you're a doctor, the data shows that it does matter, because white doctors are significantly less likely to work in our communities. Plus, white doctors carry with them all kinds of historical biases, and therefore reproduce what an author called medical apartheid. And we have a long history of race-based medicine and thinking about eugenics as a particular version of racialized conceptions of the others, of us, people of color. And I have the case here of Elaine Redick in North Carolina, who was 14 years old when she got raped. And the Eugenics Board of North Carolina declared her feeble-minded and promiscuous and decided to sterilize her. About 40 years later, she said, "I never been feeble-minded. They slandered me. They ridiculed me and harassed me. They cut me open like I was a hog." And of course, this is not only North Carolina. Michigan has also a horrific history of eugenics. But I want to alert you that the problem of eugenics and racialized medicine is not something about the Tuskegee experiment or eugenics. It's something that may have roots in the past but continue. So my concern today is mostly how racialization and whiteness remain in the medical apparatus. And intensive eugenics, so you know, it continues. Every now and then we have cases like the case in 2013 in California, where 150 female inmates were sterilized without state approvals and, of course, without their consent. So we know that studies show that white doctors are significantly less likely to give pain medication to Black patients for two reasons. One, they think that we're addicts looking for opioids. They should check the data. The data shows that white people are more likely to be addicted to this pain medication. Yeah. And secondly, because they think that we can take pain. So in this particular study of pediatricians who harbor pro-white bias, they discovered that they were more inclined to give Black patients, children, who had undergone surgical procedures, ibuprofen instead of the more potent medication oxycodone. Those of you who have experienced, had surgery know that sometimes after surgery, ibuprofen will not cut it, and you need the more powerful oxycodone. And the problem here is not you as doctors, but you as white doctors, because the lack of pain empathy has been documented not only among doctors, but among regular white folks. And unfortunately, this is not the past, this is the present. In this study, published in 2020, it shows that half of the white medical trainees believe such myths as Black people have thicker skin or they're less sensitive to nerve endings than white people. So these stereotypical views remain afloat. It's not just about ibuprofen and the like and pain, it's also about diagnostic tests. We're less likely to get electrocardiograms, chest x-rays, and cardiac operation monitoring when we present symptoms of chest pain. And in the case of African American men, we are 30% less likely to receive these diagnostic tests. So what do white doctors think about these things? Anything but racism. It wasn't me. A recent study, when the white doctors were asked to explain race inequality in healthcare, they said Black patients are passive and unintelligent and blame them for not making pointed care requests of their providers. So basically blame the victims. If you have inferior outcomes, it's not because of us, it's because of you. So what do Black and brown doctors think about racism in the medical order? They know. and they say so. They write books about this. This is my colleague, the Black man in a white coat, is a Black psychiatrist at Duke, who wrote about how race impacted his trajectory in med school at Duke. And this case, probably all of you are familiar, Susan Moore, 52-year-old, who died of COVID-19 in Indiana in December of 2020. And realizing that she was in trouble, she wanted to let the world know that race impacted her COVID-19 experience. So she said, and I'm reading here, I was in so much pain from my neck. My neck hurt so bad. But then the doctors didn't want to give her medication again because they thought that she was either faking it or looking for Oxycontin. So the doctors finally did the scan and found that she had pulmonary infiltrates and a new lymphadenopathy. So she began receiving opioid pain medication. But even then, the nurse procrastinated. And the nurse, when Susan told her that, hey, where is my medication? The nurse started saying, oh, I was marching in Black Lives Matter. And Moore said, she told her, no, I don't believe none of that. Not one bit, not one iota. You wouldn't even know how to march, possibly can even spell it. And here is the kicker for Dr. Moore. I put forth and I maintain, if I was white, I wouldn't have to go through that, she said. And the man never came back and apologized. She ended up being sent home and died 2 weeks after. And the hospital replied in typical bureaucratic fashion, you know, treatment options are always blah, 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 blah. We're good people, blah, 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 but we'll look into it. So far, no response. And we know that during the COVID-19 moment, people have been searching for how race is affecting the treatment of Black, brown folks. And unfortunately, that continues because now during the vaccination period, we know that Blacks and Latinos and Native Americans are significantly less likely to get vaccinated. And this is not vaccination hesitancy. That is because the way in which the vaccination is being rolled over will ultimately produce differential outcomes. Check the case of Florida, where they're using Publix, a supermarket, middle-class type supermarket, as the place for vaccination, which all but guarantees that people of color are less likely to get access to the vaccines. So now let me talk about you. So your life reflects whiteness. Where do you live? Who are your friends? Is your church, temple, or synagogue integrated? What school do you send your children to? What was your historical racial habitus, and has it changed? Who challenges your ideas, thoughts, and emotions on race? And for faculty and graduate students, doctors and doctors in training, is your social and personal life multicultural? And please don't fake the funk. Don't tell me, well, I remember, yeah, I know that guy, the Black guy, yeah, he's my friend. I hope you see my point. It should be self-evident. If you live segregated lives, that will lead to segregated heart, and therefore it means that whites will have racial views, behaviors, cognitions, habits, and emotions that reflect their white racial location in society. So therefore, systemic racism is you, it's us, because the system incorporates all of us. We people of color participate, and notice the quotation marks, because our participation is, for the most part, not symmetrical to that of whites. I'm not calling anyone a racist. I'm trying to say something deeper. So for whites, I'm saying that it's not you as Kevin, Crystal, Howard, or Jessica, but you as a member of the racial group in charge. You as a mostly unconscious personification of the American racial order. You are a link in the systemic racism chain. And it could not be otherwise, because once you have a system, whether it's capitalism or patriarchy, we all take part of it, whether we like it or not, but are aware of it, period. So you are not George Wallace. I'm not accusing anyone of being David Duke or a Proud Boy. Indeed, I believe most of you are very nice people, although some of you are angry birds. I can see it. But you participate in systemic racism in a passive, actuated, even neutral way. And I think this is key for understanding the continuity of systemic racism. So let me conclude by addressing what is to be done. In terms of organizations, whether it's a university or a department or a corporation, I think that you know what you need to do. You must begin changing practices. In terms of universities, hiring clusters. Don't hire one and lose three. That's the game across HWCUs. We tried to get Eduardo, but he's asking for too much money. And he comes and then he goes, yeah? So what you need to do is hiring clusters. And you have to rethink everything. When all looks white in anything you do in your organization and people of color complain or seem to be out of the loop, you must ask yourselves the question, what are we doing wrong? So the goal is to reimagine the organization and make it truly multicultural. Individually, you heard what I said, so you need to begin doing some changes in terms of conscience and practices, but hopefully you also have to have humility and realize that most likely you will not be free of individual, personal, racial cognitions and emotions until systemic racism is removed from our midst. So the personal struggle against systemic racism at the individual level is a lifelong struggle. Don't believe that you are free from racism. But fundamentally, if you want change, we can believe in, as President Obama used to say, you got to engage in social movement politics to change the practices, culture, and perceptions, and even the individuals in the movement. So social movements are perhaps the best and most efficient medicine if we want to effect systemic change. So what will you all do? Will you do your best to change the medical system and yourselves, or remain in the business of whiteness as usual, telling the world and yourselves that you are all very nice people living in the best of all possible worlds? Only time will tell. Gracias.
Good morning again. Thank you all for coming, for attending an amazing introduction to our day. Thank you, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, for your keynote, What Makes Systemic Racism Systemic? We're actually going to start off the question and answer period today with some questions that were provided by students from our Racism Lab course taught by Dr. Miles Durkee from the Psychology Department. One of the questions that I would like to start off with today, considering some of the most popular racial discrimination scales in psychology seem to lean more towards overt forms of racism that may be less common in modern times and more covert forms of discrimination, i.e. being followed by cops or being followed around in the store, as you've suggested. What kind of work can psychologists and other social scientists do to address this shift towards more covert discrimination?
Well, first, obviously, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm not saying that we should not continue doing some of the work that we have done historically on traditional forms of discrimination and sort of racial animosity. Yeah? That needs to be done. My concern is that we may be missing a lot of what is happening. Perhaps, I argue, most of what is happening by our extreme focus on the overt extreme behavior. Yeah. The other day I was talking to a colleague of yours, I don't know if she's gave a talk in Duke in our race workshop. And the question was something like, and she works on memes, yeah? And she was talking about barbecue Becky, etc. So my question was along the lines of, as important as it is for us to understand the barbecue Becky, I think that most of the people, whites, when engage in this behavior are not captured because they are clever enough to just give a phone call, etc. So therefore, we may be missing in the fighting the barbecue Becky, yeah? We miss that a lot of whites are doing that, and that is not captured through the traditional methodology. So what I think we need to do is rethink a lot of what we do, rethink the measurement strategies. And literally what I'm working on these days is on rethinking systemic racism to incorporate normative, seemingly non-racial behavior. So when people buy homes, send the kids to school, make decisions that are viewed by most of us are non-racial decisions, I think that they have a racial component. And some of them historically we can document that. So I think that in that sense, we need to then rethink and reimagine a lot of the stuff we do. And some of the strategies are already there. Yeah, the audit strategy, I think, can be extended. Yeah, and a lot of the experimental work can be targeted. If a lot of the stuff that we are thinking has this now you see it, now you don't component, why don't we then engage in experimental work to see if we can capture, experimentally, sort of racial cognition and behaviors regarding specific situations like, hey, if you have this situation, a Black person is entering into this space, what do you think is happening? Yeah, and that way we can sort of extract from the scenario racial cognitions and even emotions.
Thank you for your answer. There were actually a lot of questions relating to some of the themes raised in your final chapter of your 5th edition, relating to what can we do. This more specifically asks, does being a good actor in an oppressive system make a difference? Or is dismantling systems and rebuilding or reinventing, as you said, to form new institutions the only way? What about a critical mass of good actors in an oppressive system?
Yeah. So obviously, I want people to be good people. I don't want to have nasty people around anyone. Yeah, being good is good, but it's not enough. And if I were in the field gathering data on colorblind racism, and as an ideologies always change, morph, and evolve. So a new defensive move that I have heard in the last 5-6 years is this nonsense of I'm a good person. So I cannot be, because I'm a good person, I teach my kids right, etc. So again, I do want people to be good, but being good is not enough. What we need is a critical mass of anti-racist whites. And the anti-racist position is different from the I'm a good person position. An anti-racist is always in the struggle, in the fight, and thinks about the collective practices and mechanisms that keep the system in place. And that's what we need to attack. Yeah. The practices and mechanisms, rather than saying, I'm a good person, I'm teaching my kids right, and that's it. No, that's not enough. If you are only into putting in your backyard a sign that says Black Lives Matters, and you live in an all-white neighborhood, we have a problem, yeah? So what we need to do is then rethink our lifestyles and then re-engage in social movement politics, because that ultimately, if we want change that is systemic, we need systemic efforts to change the monster of contemporary racism in America and indeed in the world.
Thank you. And with that, students have been interested in your theories on systemic racism, but some also were curious about interventions that you noticed that you like or appreciate. More specifically, they're curious from a local perspective, are there any examples of a community, town, or city that are addressing structural racism in ways that are making a difference noticeably? What are they doing that works?
Well, I'm going to talk about academy. That's where I'm sort of targeting my efforts these days. That is not excluded of everything else, but that's what I labor, yeah? Mm-hmm. So in the academy, unfortunately, a lot of think about the last 6 months, George Floyd, the lynching, produced obviously this massive mobilization. And all of a sudden, every university president put out a statement about we do have systemic racism. I mean, they don't know what the hell they're talking about, but they all said something along the lines of we have systemic racism and we have implicit biases and we're going to do all kinds of beautiful things and we're going to put $2 million. Hello, if you are in Michigan or Duke, $2 million ain't going to cut it. We know the numbers. That is nothing. Yeah. So anyway, I think that a lot of the diversity, I call it Diversity Inc., Diversity Incorporated strategies that have been used both in corporate America as well as in university settings will not do right. Let me give you one example of an effort that for a bit I thought was successful. I worked at Texas A&M for 7 years, and while I was on my way out, a dean, Charlie Johnson, political scientist, decided to connect the money for salary increases and for tenure lines to 3 dynamics. So he told every department, we're going to deal with internationalization. So that is important for us, the traditional quality of the work, and diversity. Mm-hmm. And what that did was that a lot of these departments were 0 on the diversity front. So that allowed the dean to say, until you do right on this front, you're going to lose a third of your money. So I give you credits for your work in terms of excellence, as well as internationalization. But since you're not doing jack for diversity, we have a problem. Yeah. He also started a more interventionist approach to hiring. Yeah. And he basically said, I will monitor the way that you do your hiring, and it is okay, and you can explain and justify every now and then that you end up with 3 white male candidates. But if I see that as a pattern, and I see that the pool of applicants is a mostly white pool, or that you are not taking seriously women and people of color, then I'll go back to my concern and I may stop the hiring. Yeah. So that was beautiful for 3-4 years. After 3-4 years, universities have powerful departments and actors. So powerful actors and departments like chemistry and the like basically said, hey, we got people here who are Nobel Prizes, and they're willing to leave if you don't change the policy. So they remove him from being a dean. So I mean, to be honest, the mistake he made was he was doing the Lone Ranger strategy. If these things are going to work, we need to have a collective strategy. So it should not be one dean or even one president. It has to be more people. And then you have to create a movement behind the process, so that then, rather than being seen as it is Eduardo, or it's Gabrielle, or it is Dean Johnson, it is all of us. This is like I tell my colleagues at Duke, they keep calling me to be, hey, can you read this proposal for the diversity stuff? I'm like, I can't, because I'm only one. Diversity ought to be a collective project. And until we make this a truly collective manner, what you end up doing is imposing a black and brown tax on us. Yeah, I am taxed every day. Eduardo, can you explain? Can you talk to my class about what racism is? Like, I can. My fee is.
I like that, and I did like the commercials too as well. I'm really excited for the 6th edition. I really thank you for also bringing in the university into your answer. One of the audience members actually asked a little bit about some of the spaces or safer spaces for BIPOC communities. How do you think these spaces are critical for the safety and existence of BIPOC communities, and how do they fit within that model of all of us working together?
I missed something. The existence of what? Of what?
Safe spaces on college campuses. For Black, Indigenous people of color students.
Yeah, obviously, from the white imagination, they are like, why do you need a Black space or a Black cultural center or a Black this? Mm-hmm. And I usually tell them a joke, and it's a joke that was real. I was the president of Unión Puertorriqueña in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And we had an office that was like literally 8 by 8, okay? And here comes this white student, and he says, what is this space? I'm like, this is Unión Puertorriqueña. What do you need? I'm like, how come there is not a space for me as a white person? I told him, hey, it's UW, University of Whites. You own the entire space. What else you want? We only have an 8 by 8. You guys have the entire university, so relax, man. And then when his humor is a powerful weapon, yeah? So when he realized that he was in trouble, he then left running away. So until we de-racialize university and make it a truly universal space where safety for everybody, and everybody is welcome, and there are diversity of opinions, even of food items, until we have that, we will definitely need safe spaces, and also spaces for us critical race thinkers and practitioners where we can talk about race without beginning the discussion about, well, isn't it all about class? What you are making race is really class. It is anything but racism, yeah? So that's why at Duke, we have this race workshop as a place for us to have critical work where we begin here and then move forward rather than, is it racism or is it class?
Yeah, really, that's not only speaking to work on campus, but even within sociology, thinking about class versus race debates. There are a couple of questions about grammar and labeling. More specifically, one was curious about how whiteness is part and parcel of and continues to be reified by discourse.
Well, if I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if the question is talking about whiteness reifies race and whiteness, I strongly disagree, because the alternative is not talking about whiteness and keep talking about, for example, blackness and brownness. You know, when I was in Michigan, I taught the course. I hope they changed the title. It used to be called Problems of Race and Cultural Context. Before that, I was in Wisconsin, and the course I taught was Problems of American Racial and Ethnic Minorities. So in those two courses, in one, it was our problems, and the other one was context. Well, if the context is racism, if the context is genocide, if the context is imperialism, if the context is racialized labor exploitation, then we can talk. So for me, we need to talk about whiteness because the relations, race is not an independent event where I'm Black Puerto Rican, that's it. I am Black Puerto Rican because other people are not Black Puerto Rican. And those who are not Black Puerto Rican, who happen to be white Puerto Ricans and whites in the US, are the ones who basically control the game, the racial game of the US and indeed of Puerto Rico. So therefore, we got to talk about whiteness. Yeah? In 2 weeks, I'm going to be addressing this at UPenn and debating with some people, and some of my colleagues are going to make the argument that exactly that argument. We shouldn't talk about race. We shouldn't talk about whiteness, because the more we talk about that, the less we understand. That said, let me end with something that might be helpful for the person posing the question.
Thank you.
Talking about whiteness doesn't mean I'm saying all whites are exactly the same. If you pay attention to my statements today or have read my work lately, I do understand that racialization is not a perfect process. It's not perfect on the Black side or on the white side. There are members of the Black team that I wish I could, hey, get away. You are no longer in the team. Get out, yeah. And similarly, there are plenty of people there are some people in the white team that are our total allies, yeah? So therefore, there are fractures, and it's as important as it is to understand continuity. I mean, systems are in place because most of the time reproduction happens. But the reproduction of racial order and racialization is not perfect. Therefore, there are enough fractures for us to think about what are the elements that we can use to de-racialize this and move people from the moderate to the liberal, from the liberal to the radical, and from the radical to the revolutionary. Yeah, that's what we need to do.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you also for clarifying your perspectives and the significance of talking about whiteness. Related to that, there are a variety of questions also about the administrations, presidential administrations that have spanned your writing. I know you started talking about President Obama. The 5th edition addressed racism in the MAGA Trump era. There's a question here that suggests it may be easier to mobilize people against racism when there's a Republican rather than a Democrat president. I'm curious first how you feel about just speaking about racism through the 3 different administrations, but also do you have any recommendations for doing so in the Biden era as well?
I am pessimistic about the idea that we can organize better under a liberal administration than under the conservative. Because during the Obama moment, and I was criticized, I lost all kinds of friends because I was I voted for Obama, but I was critical of what I was predicting. And history has absolved me. Most of my predictions, I was on point. Yeah, I said he's going to avoid talking about race. He's going to tell us, hey, don't try to put too much pressure on the race front because I'm the president of all Americans, blah, blah, blah. And for us as people of color, most, same as gays and lesbians, all other interest groups, yeah, in America, working labor organizations, they make demands. And we have the right, if we are the most consistent, most supportive segment, voting for the Democratic Party, we have the right of making demands, A, B, C, D, E. So in an interesting, seemingly contradictory way, then Obama being elected made us less able to talk and push about race, because talking and pushing for race advances was viewed as you're a traitor. Yeah? In my particular case, I was told you're envious about Obama. I'm like, dude, I don't even know him. What are you talking about? Envious about what? So yeah, because now that he's president, you cannot continue talking about racism because we're now post-racial. And of course, 6 months, that fantasy life after 6 months disappeared. So let's talk quickly about right now. Right now, and I have to confess, I voted for Biden and Harris, but to be honest, I would have voted for a cucumber. Anyone but Trump, yeah? I'm not a liberal, but Trump was a peculiar character, so therefore I voted for Biden and Harris, but clear-minded that their liberal agenda may be problematic. So the issue for us now is this. A few of the things they are saying are good. I'm not going to lie. I'm liking some of the things I'm hearing from the Biden-Harris administration. But I know I am old enough to remember and to know that we, the people, the moment that we relax, the moment that we stop putting pressure, the moment that we demobilize, the moment that we're no longer in the streets is the moment that they regress to their political mean, which in this case is, we're going to give you a few crumbs, but we're going to keep the bread for ourselves. And our job is, at this moment, push, and when we're tired of pushing, push harder.
Thank you for the answer as well. We have some Racism Lab members whose research on structural racism, or your theories informed by US race relations, have also informed their projects in other contexts, specifically France. I actually want to thank Amel for her question. She says she's curious if you've been following what's happening in France with politicians saying that critical race theory is bad for French unity, among other things. What do you think about this, and how do you make sense of when we see similar patterns of discourse across different countries? And this can also relate to the Latino Americanization of the US work as well. So overall looking for the global context.
I have been following the French tradition. I'm not surprised. I was in Paris, I don't know why they invited me, but I ended up there, and everything they were happy when I was talking about the US. Oh, those Americans are racist. And then all of a sudden, I turned the lens towards France, and all of a sudden, that was it. They became Puerto Ricans. And I'm going to tell you something that probably the race scholars in the audience understand. It is indeed a pity that race theorization has come mostly from the US space, because actually racial regimes in the world, think about Latin America, we have had racial regimes 100 years longer than the US. So therefore, if the theorizations have come from what is normative in the world, which is not the US or South Africa, it is Puerto Rico, it is Cuba, it is Mexico, it is Peru, it is Europe, it is Canada. Canada is the same. You go to Canada, they will tell you the same thing. Critical race, what? We don't need that. That's divisive, yeah? So I'm not surprised about the reactions of the French, and indeed, anyone with knowledge about Latin America know that it's the same nonsense that we hear when we go to our countries, and they tell us are you importing into Puerto Rico an American problem? Are you, as my family members told me, are you a negrito acomplejado? Are you a black man with a complex? Yeah.
Thank you for also sharing other reactions to your work too, as well with that answer. Some people want to focus on policing in prisons, first, one question was about specifically your reactions to Biden's plan to close private prisons. But there's more general questions about abolitionist work. Abolitionists say that the focus on punishment is not effective and the system rarely punishes people like police officers. But people are rightfully angry and want justice through the existing systems. Can we engage with these systems to obtain justice for Black and Brown people? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm in sympathy with the Angela Davis et al. Movement towards prison abolition. And of course, that political strategy, it is combined with a strategy to restructure society. Yeah? It's not just eliminating prisons, but eliminating the forces that produce crime as a solution to lack of employment, lack of opportunities, exclusion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So we do have to reimagine punishment in the US, indeed in the world, because this prison stuff ain't working. We know, even rich people, even rich white people are saying this is not efficient. Yeah. We're spending too much money and not producing outcomes. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know this question is actually shifting, but as a working group, Racism Lab, and also other scholars who are in attendance today are very interested in your work on methods as well, and even thinking about other elements of the professional world and academia, specifically publishing. Can we talk about how institutions like journals reject or water down academic research in these areas, and what are methods to combat that? Are there any journals, and it's okay if you don't want to answer this, that are truly receptive to work that discusses the realities of racism and its impact on population health?
So obviously, within sociology, I'm talking my discipline, but obviously I know that we have people in other fields. In sociology, we know that the standard bearers are the American Sociological Review and the American Journal of Sociology. So our job is to begin pushing and pushing hard on sort of the way that they make decisions, the predilection for certain work on race. Yeah? A certain work that is accepted and other work is not accepted. And the name of the game is impact factor. The impact factor of the journal is fundamentally, they need you and I to submit papers so that they can reject us and have a higher, the more they reject, the better they do. Yeah. But if we begin submitting our papers to more open, flexible journals, such as Society of Race and Ethnicity, the relatively new journal out of the section of racial and ethnic minorities of the ASA, that journal, they have their first impact factor measurement, and it ended up being close to 2. So you know, an impact factor of 1 is okay. Anything in the 2 range is great. And for this being their first assessment, they are going in a fast track to becoming a superb journal. They actually have a higher impact factor than Social Forces. So there are places out there, there are journals out there trying to be different. And our job then is be strategic actors. I'm not saying to avoid or never submit to AJS, ASR, etc. I'm saying to be strategic, particularly if you are younger and need publications. Yeah, why are you going to continue hitting your head against the wall when the wall is telling you, no, not soup for you? So what you need to do is be plural and perhaps begin also a battle with on the politics of publication with those journals that are canonical and that are still in control of the careers of particularly younger scholars. Yeah, for me, all this at this stage, I don't care. I sort of made it. Although if you're Black, you never are totally safe. Yeah, but I'm putting my money away so that if stuff happens, I can retire early and be like, whatever. And I play the lotto. So
good plan.
That's a joke, folks. Relax.
I appreciate the humor in this as well. And I think one of the last questions I'll ask, it depends on if we have time afterwards, but it really struck me as you were speaking. One of the audience members actually asked, how are you able to maintain a kind, humorous disposition when you spend so much time uncovering the crushing brutality of systemic racism? And I know you've talked a little bit about experience writing and talking about this, but if you could share, do you ever struggle with dealing with anger or other emotional reactions? It seems to me maintaining a positive but realist disposition is crucial to maintain if we are to advocate and bring along change.
Okay, so that's a tough question. Just this morning, I was asked to write a statement on sort of how race has impacted my career. And I told the person, oh, I may not be able to do it. I have too many commitments, but let me see what I can do. And literally, I started writing, and an hour later, I had 2,000-word essay on how race has impacted my career. And again, humor, I use it in part because it's hard for us to address mostly white audiences that already have a, I don't want to hear about this. So humor has allowed me to go deeper, say and tell my truth as I see it, and then folks relax a bit, although you confuse them with humor. But on the personal level, I am as vulnerable to the impact of racism as the next person. So I have cried. I'm actually, one of the worst experiences I ever had happened to me in Michigan, but they continue happening to me in A&M, and they continue happening me in Duke, even after I became president of ASA. You know, being president is good, but it doesn't save you. I don't walk around with a special sign saying, treat me differently because I'm the president of the American Sociological Association. That is meaningless for my everyday transactions. And in the academy, obviously, the white sociological elite was not too happy with my election. Yeah? I know that for a fact. People don't know that we have networks too. And some people release information about, hey, this person has not renewed membership because you are the president, or this person is organizing an effort to create an alternative association. That is, the sort of the positivist association of sociologists who believe that sociology is a science, blah, 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 whatever. You know? So I suffered as much as the next person. I cried too, and I use humor, but at the same time, I had to confess, I'm not as efficient as I wish in maintaining my mental health and my health from not being affected by racism. And I do what some of us do, which is I talk often to Dr. Johnny Walker Black, who unfortunately talks back to me and like, hey man, relax, just have another drink and relax, yeah? So I self-medicate in part to deal and cope with the stress of racialized stress, but the racialized stress is indeed real, very real.
Thank you so much for not only your keynote, but your answers to these questions. I'm wondering if, in closing, are there any things that we can look forward to in your 6th edition?
Just two things. There is a new chapter on systemic racism. And in that chapter, I do something that I wanted to make it more useful for average readers. So I do a lot of, like I'm talking to you right now, the writing is different because we sociologists can write in a way that nobody understands us. Yeah? You can write the structure, the superstructure of the ontology, of the morphology, and this, like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah? So I'm trying to address the matter in a more direct way. And although I use empirical evidence, I'm a sociologist, I believe evidence is fundamental, but I then use as examples things that have happened to me to illustrate, yeah? So I don't want pity from anyone, but I want to be able to say, look, I went to a psychologist recommended by my doctor who told me after a minute of me talking to her, hey, you foreigners use big words and big sentences, and I think you should talk in smaller sentences and use regular words. Needless to say, after that, I'm like, I'm done. But let me begin. No, I'm out. Yeah, and that particular side anyway. So I use this as a case of an individual level, what we call now microaggressions. Yeah, when I started working, we didn't have the language of microaggressions. It has become now central for analysis. Yeah. So anyway, I have that chapter, and I have a chapter on color blindness during pandemic times, and how during the pandemic, the long tentacles of color blindness influence and shape many of our discussions. So
Well, look forward to reading.
I think it's good. I think it's good. It's still set for $30.
Thank you. Thank you so much for just all the insight you offered today, and also the sneak preview into the text. That was a personal question for me. I look forward to continuing to engage with your work, and I'm certain other members would love to reach out to you personally with more questions. But for now, this ends our first segment. We're going to adjourn, and we will rejoin together for the first panel. Thank you again.